Some men choose solitude. But for Malachi Thorne, solitude chose him. For 10 years, he had bolted the door to his own heart, sealing it with the memory of betrayal, and a vow to never again place his trust in another. His ranch, tucked away in the rugged mountains, wasn't a home. It was a fortress, built to ward off the world, and all the heartache it held. On a fierce October evening, as the storm raged its hardest, that fortress was about to be breached. The thunder cracked, shaking the window panes, as Malachi stood on his porch. The warmth from his coffee mug his only company. That's when he heard it. Not the howl of the wind. Not the snap of a branch. It was something else. A faint, keening sound. Like that of a wounded animal, nearly swallowed by the gale. He stepped out, the cold rain lashing his face instantly. And he saw her. She was folded against his wooden steps, as if her very bones had surrendered. She wore what was once a wedding gown. Now, the white silk was a ghostly gray, clinging to her frame. The fine lace, now in tatters, trailed behind her like the frayed edge of a forgotten dream. For a long moment, Malachi just stood there, motionless, the coffee still warm in his weathered hands. 10 years. 10 years without a single soul setting foot on his land. And now, a bride. The universe, it seemed, had a cruel sense of humor. He thought, for a second, that she might be dead. Just another casualty the world had left on his doorstep, to test what little humanity he had left. But then, he set his mug down. He knelt beside her, the cold rain soaking through his worn denim. Closer, he could see the faint rise and fall of her chest. Her breaths shallow and labored, fogging in the frigid air. Her dark hair was plastered to her face, but he could still make out delicate features, marred by exhaustion, and a deep, settled fear. He'd seen that look before, in the mirror. Another crack of lightning illuminated the advancing walls of rain, marching toward them like an army. Malachi glanced back at his cabin, warm, dry, safe, everything he had built to keep out complications and heartbreak. He could walk back inside, finish his coffee, and pretend he'd seen nothing. By morning, she'd either be gone, or she'd be a problem for the elements. Not for him. His peace would remain intact. But as another bolt lit up the sky, he saw the thing that made his gut clench. On her left wrist, barely visible beneath the mud and torn lace, were bruises, the ugly purple modeling of a man's grip. It was a story he, as a former lawman, knew all too well. Someone had hurt her, and she had run, so desperately that she'd ended up here, at the edge of nowhere, in a bridal gown that now looked more like a burial shroud. Malachi cursed under his breath. He scooped her up, surprised by how light she felt, soaked as she was. As he carried her toward the door, her head lolled against his shoulder. In the porch light, he caught a glimpse of her face. The kind of beauty that could make a man believe in forever. And that, to him, was more terrifying than any storm. He kicked the door open and stepped inside, bringing her, and the cold, dripping rain, into the sanctuary he had so fiercely guarded. He laid her on the couch. The very one where he had spent countless nights convincing himself he was better off alone. She stirred. Her eyes fluttered open for a heartbeat, eyes the color of a forest in spring, wide with confusion. And what might have been relief. Her lips parted, moving silently, before consciousness slipped from her again. But in that brief moment, Malachi saw something that made his chest tighten with a feeling he'd spent a decade trying to forget. Hope. And he realized, whatever had brought this woman to his door, it wasn't just going to change her life. It was about to shatter the walls he'd so carefully built around his heart. The only question was whether he was strong enough to survive at this time. 3 hours later, when she woke, the first thing she saw were a pair of eyes, the color of gunmetal gray, watching her from across the room. The second thing she noticed was the unfamiliar weight of a rough wool blanket, and that she was no longer in her wedding dress. A bolt of pure panic shot through her. She sat upright on the strange couch, clutching the blanket to her chest like a shield as the room spun. Wooden walls. A stone fireplace crackling with warmth. The smell of coffee and something that might have been soup. It was a place of safety. And that terrified her more than anything. Easy now. The man's voice was calm. Steady. He sat in a chair by the window, hands clasped loosely in front of him, making no move to approach. You're safe. Safe. The word was a stranger on her tongue. She hadn't felt safe in months. Maybe years. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for exits, for weapons, for any sign of the men who had pursued her through the storm. Where am I? Her voice was barely a whisper, her throat raw from the wind and her tears. My ranch, he said. Middle of nowhere. Which I'm guessing is exactly where you were trying to get. He tilted his head slightly, studying her. Name's Malachi Thorne. Been out here alone for about 10 years now. Alone? That explained the careful distance he kept. The way he seemed almost uncomfortable with another soul in his space. But it also meant no one knew she was here. No one could find her. A flicker of relief. Your dress was soaked through. He gestured with his chin toward the fireplace, where her gown hung from a makeshift line, steam still rising from the fabric. Figured you'd rather not freeze. He nodded toward a small table. There's dry clothes there. They belong to someone else. The pause between his words told her everything she needed to know about that someone else. Thank you. She meant it. This stranger had saved her life. But experience had taught her that kindness always came at a cost. What do you want? Something shifted in his expression. Surprise. Maybe even a little hurt. Nothing, he said, his voice flat. Storm still raging. When it passes, you can go on to wherever you were headed. It was then that it hit her. A wave of cold despair that even the fire couldn't warm. She had nowhere to go. The storm in the mountains would pass. But the storm she was running from would not. Her brother's debts wouldn't vanish just because she had fled the altar. Clayton Voss did not forgive. And he certainly didn't forget. I can't leave. The words tumbled out before she could stop them. They'll find me. They'll drag me back. She unconsciously touched her bruised wrist, the memory of Clayton's grip still a phantom pain. Malachi's expression darkened. The quiet hermit receded, and a different man looked out from his eyes. Who's looking for you? People you don't want to cross, she whispered, pulling the blanket tighter. I should go. I won't bring trouble to your door. Trouble already found my door tonight, ma'am, Malachi said, his voice low. He stood and moved to the window, peering out into the black, swirling chaos. The lightning illuminated his profile, a strong jaw, weathered skin. The face of a man who had seen too much of the world's ugliness. Question is, he said, without turning around, Whether I'm going to stand by and watch it win. He was quiet for a long moment. Besides, he added, a rough, gravelly edge to his voice, haven't had a good reason to use my rifle in years. For the first time in a long time, a fragile bloom of hope began to push through the fear in Evangeline's heart. But just as it did, another sound cut through the howl of the storm. It was not thunder. It was rhythmic, heavy, the pounding of horses' hooves on wet earth, getting closer. They had found her. Malachi heard them too. His body went rigid at the window, every muscle coiled. After 10 years of silence, he knew the difference between the sound of a storm and the sound of trouble, and that rhythmic pounding was trouble. He turned from the window, his voice suddenly sharp, stripped of all warmth. How many? Evangeline closed her eyes, listening with the practiced ear of the hunted. 4, she whispered. Maybe 5 riders. He doesn't travel light. Malachi pressed. Clayton, she said, the name like a curse. Clayton Voss. Malachi's blood ran cold. He knew the name. Every lawman from here to the territories knew it. He looked at this woman, this broken bride, and the pieces began to click into place. What does a man like Clayton Voss want with you? I was supposed to marry him today, she said, the words tasting like ash. My brother. He owes him money. A great deal of money. I was the payment. The silence that followed was heavier than the storm. In it, Malachi weighed 10 years of peace against the life of a stranger. It wasn't a fair fight. There's a root cellar, he said finally, his voice all business. Behind the kitchen. Hidden door under a rug. You'll wait there until it's over. No. Evangeline stood, clutching the blanket like armor. I won't hide while you face them. If they find me here, they'll kill you just for giving me shelter. I won't have your blood on my hands. And I won't have yours on mine. He countered, moving to a cabinet and pulling out a rifle. It settled into his hands with a familiarity that felt like a lifetime ago. Get to the cellar, he commanded, his voice leaving no room for argument. That is not a request. He moved toward the door as the hoofbeats stopped just outside. He saw the look on her face, a mix of terror and resolve. Promise me, Evangeline, he said, his voice softer than he intended. Whatever happens, you stay hidden. The way he said her name, like it mattered, broke something inside her. I promise. Then came the knock. Polite, almost friendly, the kind of knock that knows it will be answered. Malachi Thorne. A smooth voice carried through the wood. Apologies for the late hour. I'm looking for someone. A young woman. In a wedding dress. She's unwell, you see. Confused. I'm terribly concerned for her safety. Malachi opened the door just wide enough to step outside. The rifle held low, but ready. Clayton Voss sat on his horse as if he owned the world. Tall, well-dressed even in the downpour, with a smile that never touched his cold eyes. Behind him, 4 men waited, their hands resting near their guns. Voss, Malachi said, his voice flat. Mr. Thorne. Clayton touched the brim of his hat. As I said, I'm looking for my bride. Nerves, cold feet. You know how it is. Has she passed this way? Haven't seen anyone. Malachi lied, his voice a level stone wall. Clayton's smile widened. Of course not. But you won't mind if my men and I take a look around your property. Just to be sure she's safe. It wasn't a question. One of the riders, a man with a scarred face and dead eyes, was already dismounting. Actually, Malachi shifted his stance slightly, the rifle becoming more prominent. I do mind. This is private property. You want to search it, you come back with a warrant. Clayton laughed, a sound like breaking glass. A warrant? My dear fellow, you seem to be confused. I own the bank that holds the note on half this valley. Men like you exist at my pleasure. The scarred man had reached the porch now. Boss says check the house. He snarled. No. Malachi said quietly, his voice deadly calm. You're not. The world seemed to hold its breath. Even the storm quieted. Clayton's expression never changed, but something cold and calculating flickered behind his eyes. I've heard stories about you, Thorne, he said conversationally. Sheriff down in Copper Creek, wasn't it? Before you ran away up here. Heard you were quite the lawman. Until your wife found a better offer. The words hit Malachi like a physical blow. 10 years of buried pain surged to the surface. He felt Evangeline's presence behind the thin cabin wall, and it anchored him. Ancient history, he growled. Is it? Clayton leaned forward. Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you're about to risk everything all over again. For another woman who will only betray you. The scarred man took another step. Malachi raised his rifle. But just as the world was about to erupt in gunfire, a new sound emerged from the darkness. A single horse, riding hard from the direction of town. A young man wearing a deputy's badge pulled up, his horse breathing hard. Mr. Voss, he called out, looking nervous. Sheriff sent me. There's been a development at the Blackwood mine. He says he needs you back in town. Immediately. Clayton's jaw tightened with frustration. He stared at Malachi, then at the deputy, his mind clearly weighing profits and losses. The mine, it seemed, was more important. For now. This isn't over, Thorne, Clayton said, gathering his reins. That woman belongs to me. And I always collect what's mine. She doesn't belong to anyone, Malachi replied, his voice low and steady. Clayton wheeled his horse around and rode off into the darkness, his men following close behind. The young deputy lingered for a moment. You ought to be careful, Mr. Thorne, he said quietly. Clayton Voss doesn't forget. Then he too was gone. Malachi remained on the porch for a long time, the rain washing over him, his rifle still held at the ready. He had won the battle. But he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, he had just started a war. For several long minutes after the riders disappeared, Malachi stood in the doorway, letting the rain wash over him. 10 years. He had avoided this. 10 years of calculated peace. Now, in a single night, he had made an enemy of the most powerful man in the territory. All for a woman he barely knew. When he finally stepped back inside, the warmth of the cabin felt different. Charged. Evangeline was sitting on the couch, no longer hiding, the wool blanket still wrapped around her shoulders. Her face was pale, but her eyes held a new emotion. Guilt. You should have let him take me, she said, her voice quiet, but firm. Like hell, Malachi answered, setting his rifle aside. You don't understand what you've just done, she insisted. Clayton. He will come back with more men. He will burn this place to the ground. I know exactly what I've done, he said, moving to the fireplace, his back to her. He added another log to the flames. And I know exactly who Clayton Voss is. Evangeline studied his rigid silhouette against the firelight. There's history between you two. Not directly. Malachi's voice was heavy with the weight of old failures. But I've cleaned up enough of his messes to know the kind of man he is. He paused, the crackling fire filling the silence. 3 years ago, he said, his voice dropping low, when I was still wearing a badge, a young woman came to me, said Clayton was forcing her to marry him to settle her father's debts. Same story. I told her to trust the law. I told her I would protect her. The silence that followed was an answer in itself. What happened to her? Evangeline whispered. Found her body in the river a week later, he said, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. Ruled a suicide. But we all knew. I had evidence. I had witnesses. And then suddenly, I had nothing. The evidence vanished from the sheriff's office. And the sheriff, he got himself a nice new house. Evangeline felt a cold dread settle deep in her bones. Why didn't you fight it? You were the law. He turned to face her then, and in his eyes, she saw the ghost of a man who had lost faith in everything he once believed in. Because I learned that day that justice isn't about what's right. It's about who has more money. And more guns. Clayton had both. So you ran away, she said, understanding now. I survived. He corrected, his voice sharp. Same thing you're trying to do. He saw the hurt in her eyes and his tone softened. The woman. Her name was Sarah. The name hung in the air between them. A shared grief for a ghost she'd never met. So what do we do? She asked, her voice trembling. He'll be back by morning. Malachi stared into the flames, as if searching for an answer he'd lost years ago. We have maybe 12 hours before he sorts out whatever crisis pulled him away, he said finally. After that, we run, she finished for him. He turned from the fire, his jaw set like granite, his eyes holding a new, hard-won light. No, he said, his voice firm. Final. I'm done running. But before she could ask what he meant, they both froze. There was a sound on the porch. Footsteps. Malachi snatched his rifle in one fluid motion. But this time, the knock on the door was different. Tentative. Almost apologetic. Mr. Thorne. A young voice called through the door. It's Deputy Morrison. I'm alone. I swear it. Malachi approached the door cautiously, exchanging a wary glance with Evangeline. This was either a trap or the first piece of luck they'd had all night. He opened the door. Deputy Morrison stood there, dripping rainwater onto the porch, looking younger and more scared than he had before. I came to help, sir. If you'll let me. You're Clayton's man, Malachi stated, his rifle still ready. No, sir, the young man said, straightening his shoulders. I'm the law's man? Or at least, I'm trying to be. He glanced past Malachi at Evangeline. Ma'am, what happened at the church today? Your brother, Tommy. He tried to stop it. Clayton had him beaten. He's locked up in the town jail. Evangeline gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Is he? He's alive, Morrison assured her. But Clayton's holding him. Insurance. In case you got away. He looked Malachi square in the eye. That's why I'm here. Because I became a deputy to protect people, not to help rich men collect their property. And because I know what really happened to Sarah Mitchell. The name hit the room like a thunderclap. I was there when they pulled her from the river. The deputy's voice shook with conviction. I saw the marks on her throat. That wasn't suicide, Mr. Thorne. That was murder. And Sheriff Bradley buried it. Malachi felt a door he'd kept locked for 3 years creak open inside his chest. You want to help? He asked, his voice rough. How? Morrison reached into his coat. He pulled out a badge, a federal star that gleamed in the firelight. Marshal Williams is on his way from the territorial capital, he said, his words spilling out in a rush. He's been building a case against Clayton for months. Your testimony, ma'am, about the forced marriage, combined with what I know about Sarah, it might finally be enough to bring him down. Might be, Malachi repeated, skepticism lacing his tone. It's a chance, Evangeline whispered, a desperate hope in her voice. But then her face fell. But my brother. If I testify, Clayton will kill him. He'll kill him either way, Morrison said bluntly. Clayton can't afford to leave witnesses. But if we can get him arrested, we can save you both. Malachi moved back to the window, staring out at the darkness where an army of ghosts and monsters waited. Morrison, he said, turning back to the room. How long until dawn? Maybe 4 hours. And how long until Clayton realizes you're missing? The deputy's face went pale. Probably, he said. About the same. Dawn broke over the mountains, painting the cold sky the color of old steel. Malachi stood at his window, rifle in hand, watching the sun struggle through the clouds. He had not slept. Then he saw them. This time, Clayton hadn't brought just 4 men. A dozen riders approached through the morning mist, spread out in a wide, disciplined formation. This was not a posse. It was an army. They meant to finish this, one way or another. They're here, he said quietly. Evangeline joined him at the window. Her face was pale, but her eyes were clear and determined. She had changed into the spare clothes he'd given her, simple pants and a shirt that had once belonged to his wife. Somehow, she looked stronger in them. Less like a victim, and more like a woman ready to fight for her life. Morrison? She asked. Circling around to the back ridge. Malachi answered, his eyes never leaving the approaching riders. If this goes bad, he'll ride for the marshal. And if it goes well. Malachi checked his rifle one last time. Then we trust that justice still means something in this territory. The riders stopped at the edge of his property. Clayton dismounted with the casual confidence of a man who had never lost a fight he couldn't buy his way out of. This time, though, he wasn't smiling. Thorne, he called out, his voice echoing in the crisp morning air. We need to talk. Malachi stepped onto his porch. A moment later, Evangeline was beside him. He could feel her trembling, but she didn't back down. A united front. I'm listening, Malachi replied, his voice level. It's a simple trade, Clayton said, spreading his arms wide, gesturing to the armed men surrounding the cabin. The woman. For her brother. You hand her over, Tommy goes free. And you get to keep this peaceful little life you've carved out for yourself. And if I refuse? Clayton's gesture turned menacing. Then we burn it all down. and we sort through the ashes for what's left of you. It was then that Evangeline did something that surprised everyone, including herself. She stepped forward. Evangeline, no. Malachi started, reaching for her arm. But she ignored him, her voice carrying clearly across the clearing. I'll come with you. She looked directly at Clayton, her fear a cold, hard stone inside her, no longer a fire that could consume her. But I have conditions. Clayton's smile returned, cruel and mocking. You're hardly in a position to negotiate, my dear. Am I not? Her voice grew stronger. You've already proven you'll kill anyone who gets in your way. Sarah Mitchell proved that. The name made Clayton's face darken. Careful, Evangeline. No. She said, taking another step forward. We are all walking on dangerous ground. The difference is, I'm done being afraid of you. Harm either of them. And I will make sure every soul in this territory knows what kind of monster you are. Even if it's the last thing I ever do. That's when they heard it. A new sound. The thunder of approaching horses, but from the opposite direction. Riders cresting the ridge from the east, moving fast. These riders carried something Clayton's men did not. Federal badges, gleaming in the morning sun. Marshal Williams arrived with 6 men, all armed, all wearing the grim expressions of lawmen who had seen too much corruption go unpunished. Clayton's confidence faltered for the first time. He stared at the approaching lawmen, his careful plans unraveling before his eyes. Clayton Voss. The marshal called out, dismounting with practiced efficiency, his hand near his Colt. You're under arrest. For the murder of Sarah Mitchell, conspiracy, and human trafficking. You have no proof. Clayton snarled, but his eyes darted around, searching for an escape that wasn't there. We have Deputy Morrison's testimony. The marshal said, his voice calm and final. We have Miss Evangeline's statement about the forced marriage. And we have a federal investigation that's been building a case against you for months. He took a step forward. It's over. Clayton knew it was. But he would not be caged. His hand blurred as he drew his gun. The gunfight that followed was brief. But brutal. Clayton drew first, aiming for the marshal. But a single rifle shot cracked from the ridge above. Sharper, faster. Morrison's shot. When the smoke cleared, Clayton Voss lay dead in the mud, his empire of fear and violence finally at an end. For a moment, there was only silence, broken by the nervous shifting of horses. Then, the weight of 100 sleepless nights, of months of terror, finally came crashing down. Evangeline collapsed against Malachi, her strength spent, and buried her face in his chest. He wrapped his arms around her, holding her tight, as the sun finally broke free of the clouds. In the silence that followed the final gunshot, Clayton's men dropped their weapons, their fight gone with their master. Marshal Williams nodded to Malachi, a silent acknowledgement passing between 2 lawmen, one past, one present. A shared understanding of a hard job. Well done. In the days that followed, the story of Clayton Voss unraveled like a rotten thread, and his entire web of corruption came undone with it. Sheriff Bradley was arrested. The town began to breathe again, freed from a shadow it had lived under for too long. And justice, it turned out, had not entirely fled the territory. Evangeline's brother, Tommy, was freed that same day. Beaten, but alive. And when he saw his sister, safe and whole, the reunion was a quiet, tearful affair that washed away the last of the fear. And as for Malachi and Evangeline, they discovered a truth that only the broken can know, that sometimes, The most fractured souls are the only ones who can truly piece each other back together. The ranch, once Malachi's fortress against the world, slowly became a sanctuary for two. The silence was no longer empty, but filled with a quiet peace. The sound of 2 coffee mugs on the porch in the morning. The low murmur of conversation by the fire at night. They didn't need many words. They had both seen the worst of what people could do to each other, and had found in one another a reason to believe in the best again. He learned to let the world back in. She learned she was strong enough to choose her own fate. 6 months later, when the mountain wildflowers were in full bloom, there was another wedding. It was in the same small church where Evangeline had once fled in terror. But this time, everything was different. This time, she walked down the aisle willingly, her eyes fixed on the man waiting for her at the end of it. The dress was different. Simple, elegant, and hers. The groom was different. Not a monster who saw her as property, but a quiet, steady man who had shown her that love wasn't about possession, but about protection. About choosing to fight for someone, even when it would be easier to walk away. Sometimes, the greatest love stories don't begin with a perfect meeting, but with someone collapsing at your door in the rain. And sometimes, the courage to build a new life comes from the simple realization that the person you're protecting is worth more than the solitude you're clinging to. The rancher was no longer alone, and the bride had finally found her home.